All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for rating and reviewing us on iTunes. If you're watching this, please subscribe on YouTube. And thank you for supporting us at patreon.com/Matt Lewis. Excited to have back today's guest, Stephen Hayes. He's the editor and CEO of The Dispatch, also a contributor to Fox News. Stephen Hayes, welcome back to the news.
Hey, Matt, great to be back with you.
It is great to talk with you. Let's start with the Biden. It's been I think it's been about 2 years since you were on. A lot has changed. We were just launching the Dispatch.
That's right.
I'm happy that things have changed to the point where every conversation doesn't start with Trump. So let's start with Biden. How are you feeling? Where are we? Where are we now?
Well, I think in this case, the polls really do tell the story. He is struggling. He's struggling with, certainly with independents. He's lost massive ground among independents since the beginning of his administration. He's struggling with some, what have traditionally been core Democratic constituencies, particularly Latinos. I heard your conversation with Henry Olson that got into some of that. And overall, I think he's sort of caught in a tough spot between the moderates in Congress, the elected officials who really have much of his agenda in their hands, and the progressive base of the party that drives so much of the enthusiasm that Democrats need to get elected. So I think he's in a tough spot. And what's most interesting to me is that he seems like a passive actor in the whole thing. I mean, he's not sort of stepping up and being presidential. Everything that happens to him, it's as if he's not in control of what's happening. You look at the way that they talked about Afghanistan, it was sort of, well, we had to get out, we had to do this, and, bad things happen.
Right.
I think you're seeing the same thing on inflation. You've seen the same thing on the border, and I think that's amounting to some of his real trouble.
I think so too, and I wonder, if he had taken leadership and said, "We're going to pass this bipartisan infrastructure bill first. You're either going to vote for it or you're not, but we're going to vote for it, and then we're going to move on to other things I want to do." But he basically is like, I don't know. He's more acting like he is not even the head of a party, but just really trying to manage this disparate these coalitions and keep everybody happy instead of taking ownership. And I wonder, if he had actually pushed through, I think they would have passed that bipartisan bill by now.
Yeah, again, exactly right. I mean, be president, right? You're president. You're in charge. Now, that doesn't mean ignoring the reality of very tenuous majorities in both the House and the Senate. He's got to be mindful, I think, of the fact that the Progressive Caucus is a lot bigger than the handful of moderates. But he's the president. I think there's a second aspect of this that is probably underappreciated. We've seen some stories reporting on it, but I think, if you talk to Biden supporters, including people who advise him today, it's a bigger deal than sort of the public understands. And that is this difference between, or this gap between, what Joe Biden wants and the way that he talks about governing and the way that his staff go about the sort of day-to-day drudgery of policymaking. And I've talked to Republican elected officials who have been in the room with Joe Biden on the COVID relief negotiations, the infrastructure negotiations, what have you. And what they say, there's a theme. You talk to them enough, and they will tell you, you sit across from Biden, and he seems genuinely interested in some kind of bipartisan compromise. He talks about forging consensus in the way that he has tried to do in his long history in the U.S. Senate. And you leave those meetings with Biden himself thinking that something's going to get done, that he's going to help work out some kind of a compromise. And then sometimes within minutes, you get news from the rest of the White House that that's not, in fact, what is going to happen, and that they are going to be largely deferential to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, driven by White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain and some other senior advisors who are maybe more sympathetic to what the progressives want, or maybe just understand that the progressives have some some leverage because there are so many of them. But there's that disconnect, and it's talked about a lot in Washington. It's certainly talked about in Republican circles, people who have dealt with the Biden White House. I think dealt with the Biden White House in good faith, by the way, and have left disappointed at the gap between Biden and his staff.
It really seems like Biden is intimidated by the left, by woke young people. And it does seem like his staff has kind of outsized power or control. And it's almost like his attitude is like, I'm just here to manage this all and manage the decline and survive and try to run out the clock. And it's almost like an inferiority complex that he has, which I wonder how much of this is age. I mean, I was not one of those people who, bought into the whole like dementia thing or whatever. But, I do think that, Biden 20 years ago, he might have had other problems.
Yeah.
But I think it would have been different in this aspect.
Yeah. And look, I mean, I think there's a big gap between the kind of conspiracy theorizing we've seen on the right about Biden, can't wake up and tie his shoes, and people who are raising real concerns that he stumbles over his words more than he used to, that he gets into these sort of rhetorical cul-de-sacs and looks around and kind of doesn't know where to go. How do I get out of this? How do I turn around? And again, I've spoken to people who advise Joe Biden, were sympathetic to Joe Biden, who want him to succeed, who have said, going back, this was, a couple of these conversations took place in the general election campaign. So now going back, more than a year, but said that's not a crazy concern to be worried that he's just not as sort of up to it as he would have been 20, 30 years ago. And I think we should be able to raise those questions and point those things out without being accused of, being the sort of right-wing cranks who are exaggerating this for political effect.
No, I think so too. So now there's this interesting, I don't know. I've said before, I think that the Bulwark and the Dispatch, which I like both of these outlets, and I'm friends with people on both sides, but I think the names are very telling. Because I think the Bulwark sees itself as a bulwark against illiberalism on the right. And I think the Remnant is the better example. The Remnant is a remnant of real conservatives who are sort of waiting out and hopefully someday will return and restore the Republican Party. And I'm for all of those things. But I think it's interesting because like right now it seems like we're kind of at a weird turning point. Where like, if Glenn Youngkin, if he wins in Virginia, which he very well may, I think it's a close race, that would have, I think, the effect of chastening Democrats and stalling out Obama's agenda. And the question is, what is better for like America and the right? Is it better for Republicans to just get routed across the board, to lose everything and to kind of bottom out and to force them to abandon Trump, to abandon the big lie and to, condemn what happened on January 6th? Or is there a way that we can sort of muddle through this? And if we elect some, decent Republicans who like, they can't really stand up to Trump 100%, but maybe we can get through this. Like, where do you come down on? That's a long wind up. Where do you come down on that?
No, but I think it's a very good question. I mean, I think this is one of the things that's divided the sort of Trump skeptical or anti-Trump right is this question. And I think the prudent thing is to take these things on a case-by-case basis. I don't think it made sense. And I had some differences with my friends at the Bulwark on this. Before the November 2020 elections, you had several of them making the argument that Republicans everywhere and always had to lose, and that the thing to do was to vote against Republicans. The shorthand was the burn it all down approach. Everybody had to lose everywhere. And I can understand the concerns with a party that was increasingly going, I would say, irresponsibly populist, irresponsibly nationalist. So in that sense, I was sympathetic to what animated the argument. But at the end of the day, that would have been meant things like opposing Anthony Gonzalez in Ohio, who had been pretty blunt about his differences with Trump. And then after the election and after January 6th, became one of the sort of leading critics of Trump and said, look, it's important that we not abet this big lie. It would have meant opposing people like Liz Cheney, who has become sort of a conservative standard bearer of the non-Trump conservatives. And there are non-Trump conservatives. So I think, that kind of blanket approach didn't make a ton of sense then. And I think in retrospect, it's clear that some of the leaders of the more sane center right came out of a group that would have been cast aside if you embraced the burn it all down approach. Now, having said that, I think in the case of somebody like Glenn Youngkin, it's easy to have mixed views on it, right? I mean, he sort of played footsie with the big lie stuff and refused to answer questions in a forthright way about how whether Trump really was robbed or whether he wasn't. He certainly embraced Trump in the Republican primary in a pretty prominent way and has distanced himself since in a general election. But I look at Terry McAuliffe, and there's no universe in which I see that guy as the answer. I mean, I remember, this is probably because I'm so old, but I remember Terry McAuliffe from back in the Clinton years, and he was a slick political operative.
Yeah.
Who was far more comfortable than I think people should be in selling BS, and that's what he's doing now.
Didn't he leave his wife in the hospital delivering their baby to go to a fundraiser or something?
I remember that story.
There's a story.
He told that story, right? I think I don't know. I don't remember the details, but I remember that story. And if you look at the kinds of things that he's saying now, he got into a kerfuffle with Axios when they asked him about his attempts to tie Youngkin to Trump, and he said, in effect, I'm not really doing that. He's doing that himself. He pretended that he had this gaffe in a debate about education, where he said basically, I don't want parents helping to choose what teachers teach, and kind of stood by that for the first couple of days. One suspects that the polling on that came back in a pretty negative. There's public polling that suggests that was a bad answer. And then rather than say, hey, I was misunderstood, hey, this wasn't, he just sort of flatly denied that he had said, in effect, what he said, released a video saying, this is being mischaracterized and taken out of context. Well, it really wasn't. That's what he said. He got in trouble for it.
Yeah.
So I have a hard time. And he's fundamentally, he's much more of a sort of New Deal Democrat than a hard left Democrat, but he's also, I think, very attentive to where the Democratic Party is going, and the Democratic Party is driven. If the center of gravity in the party is driven by progressives, I expect that Terry McAuliffe will end up there.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, McAuliffe and Biden are not leftists in themselves, but I think both of them are being pushed that way. And so it doesn't really matter to me that they're kind of old school liberals, because, look what's happening in Loudoun County right now, or the stuff that the left is up to. I mean, saying what was there some story that some academic, a prominent academic, said something to the effect of rigorous thought is a white supremacist holder. I'm sort of botching the details. We have the stuff in Loudoun County where you've got that dad whose daughter was allegedly raped. There's a piece in the Washington Post that's amazing today, detailing the allegations of what happened in this high school bathroom. You've got, this culture war stuff, which, again, I don't want to get too caught up in it, but I think, this is really, stuff is really happening out there. And I can't imagine, sort of as a center right person, allying myself with the left in some of these battles.
Yeah, that's where I find myself. I mean, so much of the problem with our public debate about these culture war issues is that particularly in a 24/7 news cycle with Twitter being a dominant medium among journalists, nuance is stripped out of virtually all of these debates, and it's whatever the shortest the shortest take is that will provoke the most outrage from your own side. And it's a really crappy way of having these debates. But I think one of the big takeaways for those of us on the center right who are really uncomfortable even thinking about allying with the left on things like this is that however nuanced and complicated the debates themselves are, it's not very hard to come out and say, to use the quote from the academic, no, you know what? High expectations for students of all races, colors, ethnicities, that's not white supremacist. That's good for everybody. And it's nonsense that you would pretend that that's some remnant of the patriarchy or white supremacy. It's not. It's good for everybody. And you don't hear that from too many prominent Democrats and I think folks on the left. You do hear it. You do hear it in some cases. I want to make clear. I mean, there was this series of incidents at Yale University's law school where the university went after a student, basically threatened a student who had sent an email that generated criticism from some, I would say, woke folks at Yale. And you've had some prominent liberals stand up and say, "Hey, this is too far. The administration handled this poorly." And I think we sort of need more of that. If left folks are willing to call out their side when they overstep or do something outrageous, and right folks are willing to do that on their side, that I think could be the basis for a better conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to be guilty of nut picking, but like, you don't have to look hard to see. There was a story, I think it was at Kenyon College, maybe, where some of the students were upset that there could be a, quote, cisgendered janitor coming to their room. And then you have someone like Barack Obama, who was in Virginia the other day, and he's doing his whole, like, they want to divide us. They want to talk about the, it's sort of basically mocking culture wars as if it's all overblown and doesn't exist. And then I look in the Washington Post and I see a story, again, not from a politician, but from some prominent education experts and academic types saying, like, actually, parents don't have a say and shouldn't have a say in what their kids learn. It should be up to the school superintendent or whatever. And I'm like, which is it? Like, Obama's going to say that, like, these culture wars are, like, made up. And then actually, and I don't think this is nut picking. This is in the Washington Post by people that they deem to be prominent enough to publish in the Washington Post. So, like, I don't want to be one of these crazy, right wingers who is, like, up in arms all the time over everything and convinced that the sky is falling. But, like, there's some stuff going on out there.
Yeah, and I think Obama is a really terrific example because you take him out of the political context. I can't remember when he said this, but I think it was within the past 2 years. It was at like an academic conference, maybe an Atlantic Ideas Festival or something like this. And Obama gave a really strong rebuke to sort of campus wokes, saying in effect, "Hey, we have to have these discussions. Yeah. You shouldn't be protected from ideas that might make you uncomfortable. We've got to engage on this stuff." And it was a great moment from Obama, really great. And then you put Obama a week before a political campaign, and you've got him making this other argument. Now, having said that, look, I mean, and Matt, you've written about this, you've talked about it a bunch. I know you and I see a lot of this the same way. It is the case that if you look at the kinds of stuff that you're getting from the center right today, it looks very different than what you were getting 6-7 years ago, right? I mean, there is a lot more. I would say there is a lot more, sometimes overt racism from the right, sometimes sort of wink, wink, nod, nod race baiting from the right, more than I would have guessed 6-7 years ago. And that's a problem. So
Yeah.
you
Well,
imagine
the
that
interesting
Obama's
thing
talking
though,
about that, right?
well, and the interesting thing though, Steve, is I think that what happened is Trump, I think, helped create this. And then you had people like me and you, I think too, right? Who we're very uncomfortable with
Right.
the illiberal right, and the and so I think that we could have potentially. This goes to the earlier conversation. We people like us, maybe not us, but people in our space could have been gettable by a Democratic Party that really was centrist, like with Joe Biden as the nominee, a Democratic Party that just wanted to occupy the center. And I think that the left has made that impossible. So now we kind of have this horseshoe thing happening where like there isn't really a centrist party in America, and you have to kind of pick a side. And the weird thing is, I think because identity politics has become almost inescapable, you don't even have to pick a side. Like mostly the side is picked for you.
Right.
I
Right.
mean, and that's horrible, by the way. I think that's horrible for America, horrible for democracy. But if you're like, I mean, if you're like a white cisgendered, I'll use the term Christian, male, um, living in suburbia, um, you're probably going to end up getting pushed. I think at least right now, you've been pushed back into the Republican camp, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's showing up in polling, and I think that's probably right, particularly because you have Democrats right now who have the levers of power, and there's sort of broader dissatisfaction with the way Joe Biden's running the country, what Democrats are doing and saying. And I think you layer that on top of some of the culture war stuff that's proven so resonant among not only the Republican base, but I mean, this is part of the reason that Donald Trump won those working class former Democrats, right? I mean, he was speaking to some of their grievances, and while I think he's full of it in a lot of respects, and he sought to sort of make those voters believe that they're victims more than they are victims. He also wasn't wrong about some of this stuff. He pointed out, I think, real injustices, or at least raised real concerns about some of this stuff. Is it, to go to the Loudoun County example that you raised earlier? Is it crazy to worry about co-ed transgender bathrooms? Is it crazy for the parent of a father who's got a daughter who competes in high school sports to be frustrated if his daughter is the next day competing against a track athlete who is a boy or was a boy? I mean, I don't think those things are crazy. They're difficult issues. They're
Yeah.
hard to talk through in some respects, but it's not crazy to feel those
Yeah, and
frustrations at
at the
all.
very least, if you have reservations about these things, that should not brand you as a misogynistic, transphobe, white supremacist or
Right.
something, right?
Exactly right.
And that's kind of where we're at. Uh,
Well, look at the response to Condoleezza Rice made an appearance on The View the other day and gave what I thought was a very compelling, coherent, impassioned argument against critical race theory. And immediately critics on the left are saying that she is, I forget the exact phrase, but it's something like a water carrier for white supremacy. Well, no, she's not. Like, that's absolutely ridiculous, and it's offensive for them to say that.
so, yeah, it's really messed up. I feel like both sides are crazy and evil, and you're pushed into one or the other. This polarization and the dynamics here are really pushing people to I think, to their tribe, to their identity politics tribe, um, and that is not good or not healthy. With that as kind of the backdrop, um, I do hope that the Republican Party can find their way out of this. But obviously, like one of the problems is that Trump may not go away. If you're betting today, Steve Hayes, Uh, is Donald Trump the Republican nominee in 2024?
I mean, I've bet wrong on Trump a number of times, going back 5 or 6 years. I would say better than even money that if he decides to run, he would get the nomination. But I disagree strongly with folks who think it's a foregone conclusion. I think there's a race to be had. I think there's a debate to be had. I mean, if you look at, there, depending on which poll you believe, there are polls that suggest Donald Trump doesn't even have a majority of support among Republicans to be the Republican nominee in 2024. And at that point, I mean, at this point, given the fact that he was president, and given the fact that his loyalty numbers remain pretty high among Republicans, I think if you think Trump is bad for Republicans and bad for our politics, you can't help but be encouraged by that. Having said that, I mean, January 6th happened. The guy's out there every single day lying about January 6th. He's attacking other Republicans. He's making stuff up on the regular. And you have such wussies as leaders of the Republican Party, and I'm thinking here especially of Kevin McCarthy, that they can't even stand up to that. I mean, Kevin McCarthy blamed Donald Trump for inciting the riot on January 6th, held him responsible, gave a speech identifying Trump as the force behind the violence that we saw. And now he's cuddling up to Trump, and he's got his henchmen running around threatening Republican consultants who would even consider working for Liz Cheney because she's not on the Trump train. I mean, that is a party and a leadership that is sick.
That's going to be our clip when I promote this conversation. That's going to get clicks. But I think partly because you really mean it. It's obviously passionate. And I think you're completely right. 2024. So like, let's say whether Trump runs or not. And by the way, I put out the bat signal and I asked people like, what should I ask Stephen? And several people asked me to ask you about 2024. And one of the questions is, would it be, Chris Christie or Nikki Haley or DeSantis? Where do you put your money in terms of, I mean, I kind of argue that Christie is underrated because he's got the toughness and he can talk, and he'll take it to Trump, and he'll go after the media. I mean, maybe DeSantis is the same way, but fresher. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think DeSantis is somebody who much more has sort of his finger on the pulse of what the right wants these days. It's the cliche is that he's Trumpy without being Trump. So he's got a lot of the things that people see as positives with Trump. He doesn't take any grief. He's happy to not only participate in these culture war fights with the media and the left, he's happy to pick them. He doesn't back down. He doesn't apologize. He's even, I think, successfully mimicked Trump's hand gestures to a pretty remarkable degree. So if you want an uncompromising fighter to take on the left, which I think is really one of the main messages coming out of the Trump years, that's what Republicans want. Then I think DeSantis is somebody that Republicans have looked to in recent months and will continue to look to if he were to decide to take Trump on. I think somebody else like a Tom Cotton is a very interesting figure at this moment. I've joked with you before that I have these ideas for things that I want to write, which I do too infrequently these days, or podcast guests or points that I want to make. And then I look up and I see that you've written the column where you've had these people on your podcast, and your Tom Cotton piece was exactly that. I mean, he was certainly sympathetic to a lot of Trump arguments on policy, particularly on the arguments that I think drove some of Trump's popularity, things like immigration and others. And Cotton is one of the smartest members of Congress, whether you agree with him or not. Definitely one of the smartest members of Congress. And again, somebody who's willing to engage in those culture war fights, and I think comes to it from a genuine place. He believes the stuff that he's arguing. But January 6th was too much for him. Now, he didn't vote to impeach the president, but he had some pretty strong things to say about what happened there. I think that, if you're a Trump diehard, that probably disqualifies you.
Yeah.
Or disqualifies Tom Cotton. But if you're sort of a Republican who, there are lots of Republicans who say, look, I was with Trump on the policies. I just wish he wouldn't tweet as much. I wish he would. If you're in that bucket, I think that's a pretty big bucket. Tom Cotton probably has some appeal too.
Yeah, I think Cotton is probably winning the Matt Lewis primary for now, which probably dooms him, actually, based on the track record. But I would say, according to David Drucker's reporting, Cotton worked behind the scenes with McConnell to try to stop the attempt to not certify the election. And in my book, that puts him on the positive ledger in the hero section, at least deserving an asterisk.
I'm with you. Look, that's a big deal. It's sort of sad that we're at the point that like not abetting a lie to steal an election is the thing that we look to as sort of a heroic stance. But it is, and it was, and I think for somebody like Tom Cotton, it comes from Arkansas, where Trump is very popular. Yeah. And with we know that Cotton has presidential ambitions. To have him stand up is not a small thing. One wishes that more people would have sort of followed along and made the kind of public break that Cotton did.
The other thing about Cotton that I like is I feel like he's right on China. And this is an area where I think Trump, it's funny because I think my sense is that Trump's policies toward China were actually not effective and possibly counter to our interests. However, I think that Trump forced Americans to realize that China is at best an adversary. Like, I don't think that was the case before 2016. I think now it is very clear, and I'm very concerned about American businesses, Disney, ESPN, NFL, NBA, who prioritize the profit motive over patriotism. And I think that Cotton is someone who is a leader on that fight. But where are you right now on China?
Yeah, and Cotton, to his credit, was making substantive arguments. I mean, if you look back at the basis for Donald Trump's criticism of China, it appears largely to be a misunderstanding. He gave an interview, I believe it was to the New York Times op-ed page. I'm sorry if I'm mistaken on that, but it was back during the campaign, and he was asked about debt and deficits and the debt that China has on the United States. And Trump went on this long stem winder about trade deficits and suggested he didn't quite understand the issues at play. And, in effect, that was one of the main reasons that he took the position that he took on China and decided to, in effect, start a trade war, which turns out not easy to win, contrary to Trump's claims at the time. But Cotton has, I think, substantive national security driven policy concerns. He was very early on the influence of Huawei in potentially using Huawei to gain access to intelligence in the Western world. He's been sounding the alarms on Xi and what Xi wants and what the Chinese Communist Party is becoming long before it was popular to do so. And I think he deserves credit. And Cotton was early. He's been early on a number of issues, including ones that at some times put him at odds with fellow Republicans. There was a big center-right push for criminal justice reform that saw a lot of Republicans teaming up with Democrats on criminal justice reform. And Cotton sort of put his foot down and said, not me. I'm not for it. We don't have I think one of his lines was, "We don't have an over incarceration problem in the United States. We have an under incarceration problem in the United States." And I have some differences on the way that he sees the issue, to be sure, but you look at what's happening with crime, in particular violent crime, here in the United States now, and I think Cotton's going to be able to point back 6, 8 years and
Yeah.
say, "I said we should not be doing this, and here's where we are."
um, China tested this hypersonic missile. How worried? How big of a deal is that?
So I think it's a pretty big deal. Both because of what it says about their the advanced state of their technology in terms of not just nuclear weapons delivery capabilities, but also conventional weapons. I think in the context of Taiwan, it's the kind of thing that I think should make us sit up and take notice at the very least. And it's the reporting is that it surprised the U.S. intelligence community, and I think, as I understand it from talking to folks who know the issue better than I do and have seen some of the intelligence, the specifics of the test surprised the U.S. intelligence community. But we've had broad warnings about China on this kind of advanced military technology for a while, and you started to hear earlier this summer and then through the early parts of the fall, intelligence community officials, both in sort of public hearings and lawmakers who sit on the intelligence related committees or armed services committees, echoing those warnings and saying, "Hey, we better really pay attention
Yeah.
now." And for me, the reason this matters, I guess I think some of the culture war stuff is worth the fight, and there's a case to be made that on sort of fundamental culture war issues, it's worth having the discussions. It's worth trying to engage on that. But you do worry that when you look at something like this news, when you look at the broader military buildup that we've seen from China, when you look at the hostile rhetoric, the really belligerent rhetoric coming from senior Chinese regime officials, it just makes you wonder whether we're going to be in a situation in 6 months or 12 months or 2 years where we look back on some of the things that we've spent so much time discussing and debating now and think, what were we doing? Why were we not having a more serious debate as a country?
I think, though, the problem isn't that we're having the culture war arguments, it's that we have to have them, right? And so, I would argue that some of the things the left want to do actually could make it less likely that we are the kind of country that is cohesive and tough enough and united enough. So, I see the culture war attacks from the left as eroding some of the things that would make us the kind of country that actually could be a world leader and take on adversaries who don't mess around. They're not gonna. China's not gonna worry about using the right pronoun as they're rolling over Taiwan and putting Uyghurs in prison camps or re-education camps. And I'm not saying that we should play that game, but I am saying that I think that there's a point at which there is a point of diminishing returns, shall we say.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I mean, I would say that my criticism extends to both sides of the culture war fights. I mean, I think of the what was it, a week-long fight over Dr. Seuss. The fights over the vaccine mandate. Not to say that the latter isn't a real issue with some real policy implications. But you look at that on the one hand, and then the Biden administration releases its gender policy this week, and has been, I think, prominently referring to pregnant women as pregnant people. You just think about this kind of stuff, and I guess I look at that in the context of these broader threats. I mean, look, the Iranians launched an attack by proxy on a U.S. base just within the past couple of days. These threats that we've been worried about for the past several years have not gone away, and I would argue that in the aftermath of the catastrophe and the debacle of withdrawal in Afghanistan, in some ways are growing. And here we are arguing about pronouns.
You know what's interesting is I feel like one of the differences between people on the left and conservatives is that people on the left really feel like America is so resilient that nothing could tear us apart. I interviewed Glenn Greenwald recently on this show, and I asked him about Trump's illiberalism and why, there was a perception that Glenn went easy on Trump, even though he's of the left. And Glenn basically told me, I'm paraphrasing here, but Glenn basically told me that he wasn't worried because he knew Trump couldn't do what Trump wanted to do because the deep state and American institutions were resilient and would prevent him. It's an interesting thing it's an interesting, we can argue as to, but I
don't
think
take the same comfort. I'll just say that. I don't take the same comfort. And I wouldn't be comforted even if you were right.
There's a lot to say about that, but I'll just say this. I do think that people on the left think, man, you can throw anything you want at America. You can bring in millions of immigrants. They can handle it. That won't mess anything up. Boys can be girls, whatever. It's fine. We'll get. I think, like, I'm all for change and evolution and reform, and like some old ideas have to go. But I do think that any civilization, if you throw too much at it too quick, you could topple it over, and then goodbye liberalism. Goodbye. All the things that liberals and progressives ostensibly want is out the window if the Taliban marches in or the Chinese army marches in. I'm probably sounding crazy at this point, but I do think that if we want to conserve liberalism and liberal democracy, we can't go too crazy or we'll lose it all.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that that's a fair warning. And I would say that that's in some ways, it's a charitable description of the left or the hard left, because in some ways, I think you're right to say that they don't worry, or they don't think that these things could threaten sort of the fabric of America, lead to a disintegration of America as we've come to know it. But I would say that there's another group on the left that would just as soon see the disintegration of America. So that what you're describing as a warning is instead a feature rather than a bug, right. Where they would say, let's accelerate this, because what we have in America is this hopelessly racist, patriarchal society that ought to be dismantled and remade in the way that we on the left want to remake it. And, again, I think it's laudable that you go out of your way to avoid nut picking. It's something that we do at the Dispatch as well. You don't want to take a one radical argument on one side and make it speak for an entire side of the political spectrum. But I would say that's not a marginal enough view. I wish that it wasn't held by as many people on the left as it is, who basically think that America's think that America's hopelessly racist and patriarchal, and that there's not really much good to preserve.
Yeah, that's the problem. I think you got a lot of people on the left that think America is defined by, the 1619, and it's right. It's born in sin, not in liberty, not conceived in liberty, but conceived in sin, and it's an evil country because of that. And then you've got people on the right now who think America is an evil, secular, debaucherous place as well that deserves to, be taken down a peg or two, right?
Yeah, and what they have in common is they're both, I think, willing to use illiberal means to get there. Yeah. You've seen this, I think, particularly in the rise of the illiberal right, which I think is a problem and a threat. But the 1619 Project, that's a great example. And that I think is evidence that this is not nut picking. That's the New York Times. The New York Times published what I think is a very radical piece of history, a distorted piece of history, in many ways an inaccurate piece of history. The way that they sold it was anti-factual in many respects. They were caught doing that. And the New York Times has stood by the reporting, has stood by the arguments. And I was having a conversation with a good friend within the past couple of weeks who's pretty Trumpy, very Trumpy, and said to me, his argument to me is, you're sort of hopelessly naive if you don't understand that this is real war, and that you have to have somebody like Trump, whatever his flaws, to go after the left. That you're just sort of naive. And I think in many respects that is the argument from the illiberal right. And his number one point was 1619 in the New York Times. Yeah. And he said, look, we know some of the claims that they made are false. And that yet the New York Times is standing by them. How am I to believe anything that comes from the New York Times since? And I would make this counter argument. I know a lot of reporters at the New York Times, some of them are the best. And the problem isn't that the New York Times is monolithically left wing. It's that they have really good reporters who appear on the front page with really bad ideological left wing reporters. And that's the problem. But he wasn't buying it.
I'm sympathetic to the idea that the left is so bad that we had to, fight but I don't think we fully explore. Like I think my sense was that was a premature assumption. I would have liked to have seen, if we had now who knows if this could have happened, but if we had a President Marco Rubio and a Vice President Nikki Haley, and we had tried to change the culture and persuade, maybe I'm naive now, okay, but if that didn't work, if we had given that a sincere effort, I might then have ultimately concluded, okay, the gloves have to come off. We have to fight fire with fire a little bit. But I don't think that we ever really got that experiment that I was really hoping to see, if we could kind of win hearts and minds that way.
Yeah, I mean, you and me both, right? The one of the things I'm most concerned about in our politics today is the total absence of persuasion. It's just all power politics, right? I mean, the right, so many people on the right, I mean, and this is definitely true of the past 5 years and the embrace of Donald Trump. It's an ends justifies the means approach to politics. Sort of whatever we need to do to win, we need to do. I mean, you can see this in the increasing rationalization of what happened on January 6th. You remember those days right after January 6th, and you had most Republicans either condemning Trump directly, expressing regret for what had happened, saying that this was appalling, what have you. And you now have too many Republicans, and in many cases, some of the very same Republicans who previously condemned this, in effect rationalizing this. Yeah. And boy, we are in trouble in our politics if you get to the point where you're so obsessed with taking power or retaking power in the case of the House Republicans that you're willing to basically whitewash an attack on the U.S. Capitol. And I think that's exactly what Kevin McCarthy and House Republican leadership is doing these days. And I think it's one of the more shameful episodes in recent American politics.
Another point too, going back to the argument of like, did the right need Trump? Some of the stuff that the left and the media, but I repeat myself, some of the stuff that the left and the media have done, Ted Cruz, some of the stuff the left and the media have done in the last 5 years probably wouldn't have happened without Donald Trump. Like, I think he has, accelerated some of this stuff and even brought some of it out. So anyway, let's leave that at that. I do want to finish with a little bit of a lightning round, because I did get some questions from people. We've talked about most of them.
Should I be nervous?
You should not be nervous.
Okay.
So one of the questions we have is the Packers post Aaron Rodgers. Obviously the Packers really, it's been, 25 years since you didn't have a quarterback, right? Because you had Brett Favre and you went immediately to Aaron Rodgers. So you've had two kind of legacy quarterbacks. What's it like after that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, for those of us who grew up in the era of Lynn Dickey and David Whitehurst and others, Rich Campbell and other quarterbacks who didn't fare as well as Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers, it's been a treat to have lived through this era of Packer fandom. I wish that we would have won more than two Super Bowls. Does that make me greedy? Maybe. I don't think we had great coaching under Mike McCarthy, and I feel bad for Cowboys fans who have to endure his coaching now with a pretty good offensive team. Uh, you know, I in the offseason with all of the Aaron Rodgers drama, I was sort of done with him. It's hard to imagine given how good he is. I think he's one of, if not the best quarterback in the history of the NFL. I think you probably have to say Tom Brady is the GOAT, but I
I
don't
think
know that.
the 6 rings or whatever he's got
Yeah,
leads in
and
there.
600 touchdowns. I mean, he's sort of insane. But if I were starting an NFL franchise and I could choose a quarterback from any era, other than Tom Brady, I don't think I pick anyone other than Aaron Rodgers. But he was such a drama queen with the offseason antics. It was just
Was
sort of
he was
enough.
he always that way, or has he kind of gotten out of touch and like sort of like the way like a movie star or an actor might like eventually become like, disconnected from his roots?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I would say I'm observing from a far enough distance that I can't really speak with any authority. I mean, I think I read every single word that's published about the Green Bay Packers. So, in terms of just hoovering information in and come into a judgment, he does seem to have changed as he's gotten better. He seems sort of cockier and certainly more willing to assert himself and stir stuff up, which I think is unfortunate. But look, I don't. Jordan Love, the Packers picked in the first round. I don't have a ton of confidence that he's the next guy, and that makes me worried about what comes in a post Aaron Rodgers Packers era.
All right, so here's going to be a weird compliment. Uh, you got a George Clooney thing going on today. You got a George Clooney look. I'm not joking.
I think I get that from time to time. I think it's just the gray hair, the increasingly gray hair. I mean, I would say if there's any George Clooney thing, and I don't think there really is, but I'm happy to have you say that it's George Clooney at an all you can eat buffet for about 5 years. That might be closer.
Well, if you're listening, go to the YouTube page and let me know if I'm wrong. A lot of people asked this random question. I know it's not random, but they wanted you to talk about Spanish wine. Uh,
Yeah.
what's the deal?
I mean, I could go for hours, and I know this is lightning. I failed on the lightning aspect of the Packer question, so I'll try to be better. Yeah, so I lived in Spain for a year with my family from July of 2018 to July of 2019, and I liked Spanish wine and Spanish food before I went. But while we were in Spain, the quality of Spanish wine that you can get for dirt cheap is just incredible. And I came to realize there's a ton of great regions for Spanish wine, in particular Spanish red wine. Rioja is probably the best known. My favorite is a region not too far from Rioja called Ribera del Duero, which makes just fantastic, sort of big, bold red wines, usually with Tempranillo grapes. And there's another region that's close to that, sort of a sub-region almost, called Toro, which has these huge, muscular red wines, great with a big steak. I would put those wines up against any wines in the world, dollar for dollar in terms of quality.
You should do maybe like a dispatch special thing, right? Like for top tier supporters, they could come
Yes,
and drink some Spanish wine with you.
yes,
You could talk
yes.
about it. That would be a great
I'm for it.
incentive.
So we've talked about this is news and breaking news here on Matt Lewis in the News. We've talked about we do these things called dispatch lives for our members. It's basically like a half hour of a panel discussion like you'd see on a Meet the Press panel or something, and then a half hour where members can ask us. This is a streaming thing where members can ask Jonah Goldberg or David French, Sarah Isker, or some of our other reporters and editors questions about what's going on in the news of the day or other things. And I often get questions about Spanish wine. But we are going to start bringing in guests for those. We're going to start doing them more frequently, probably get up to the point where we do them weekly, and we're going to bring in guests. And one of my guests, he doesn't know it yet, is the owner of a terrific wine shop in Madrid that was right around the corner from my house. And I'm going to have him do a Spanish wine tasting for
That's
our
awesome.
members, which, yeah, he'll make some recommendations about wines that people should get that are easy to get, and we'll do a tasting. I think it'll be a lot of fun.
I have Jose Andres' email address if you ever need it.
Oh, that's amazing. I ate at his Spanish diner. This was a big splurge for my family. I ate at his Spanish diner outside of DC on Sunday night, and the food was extraordinary.
He's good. Good guy, good food, and sadly he hasn't come on my podcast yet. But he did email me back. So and
Soon,
I'm a fan also.
keep pushing. I would love
I'm
that
gonna.
episode.
And Oyamel, which is
It's
his
great.
street Mexican sort of food, is a great restaurant as well. Which leaves me to my last question. Best chicken wing spots in DC.
Ooh, that's a great question. You know, my old school, I was just telling my son about this last night, as a matter of fact. I spent time there when I was dating my now wife. It's on the campus of Georgetown University, where I did some graduate school work, and it's a place called the Tombs, an underground restaurant that used to serve cheap beer by the pitcher, and had really good wings. I would say the Tombs is definitely in the conversation. Other than that, Glory Days is a chain, but has pretty good wings and pretty good flavors. I think the best wing place in the country is a place called Wild Wing Cafe, that's down predominantly in the southeast. Has fantastic wing sauce flavors. I'm sort of a traditionalist. I like the buffalo, and I like them really, really hot. But they have a jalapeno cheddar that's just outstanding, and really terrific place for wings.
My stomach's growling.
This is
Time to
why I
go.
look like this is why I look like this.
Clooney at the buffet. I like that. There are worse. There are worse things. As you know, I'm a big fan of the Dispatch. I'm a big fan of you. Let's just take us out of here on this. How can people read you, and how can they sign up for the Dispatch?
Yeah, they can go to thedispatch.com. We have a mix of things that are free for people to consume. So if you follow people like Jonah Goldberg, David French, Sarah Isker, Haley Bird Wilt, you can get a lot of their content for free. And then we have a membership tier. It's $10 a month, $100 a year, where we give you more of that and then some to join us. So it's a good, we're having a great time with it. We had great hopes when we launched a little more than 2 years ago. It was 2 years ago this month. We thought we'd get a few thousand people to sign up, and we've been really gratified by how many people sort of beyond that. One of the questions when you launch a small business is sort of, does anybody want the stuff we're going to provide? And, we were pretty confident that people would, but you never know. And it turns out there's a much, much bigger audience for sort of fact-based reporting and analysis from a center-right perspective on politics, policy, and analysis. Stuff that rejects hysteria, but takes these things seriously, a little slower, a little more contextual. So we're pretty excited about where we're going, and we'd love to have your listeners join us.
Yeah, everyone, please do go to the Dispatch, sign up. Highly recommend it. Big fan. Stephen Hayes, thank you for coming back on the news.
Anytime, Matt. Appreciate it.